Hey friend, welcome back to the channel. This is an exciting time to make content, specifically video podcasts. Spotify CEO Daniel Ek shared on LinkedIn that the platform now hosts over 250,000 video podcasts and over 170 million users are tuning in to watch them. I also looked at the top 100 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, and 58% are also video podcasts with big audiences on YouTube. So if you're thinking about starting a video podcast, you're up to something big. But there are different ways to produce a video podcast, from recording remotely on your computer to the big productions that you see on the most mainstream podcasts on YouTube. There are different ways to record a video podcast, any imaginable equipment for different production needs, and different strategies for distribution. This is why I decided to share my expertise in the subject with you. I'm Veronica, the content marketing director and instructor inside the programs at Pad Sound School. I have personally helped businesses and creators produce their own shows. And in this video, I'll share my framework for focusing on what's important when starting a video podcast. You're invited to a strategy session with me, classes in session. Also, as a bonus, I created a workbook specifically for this video. You can fill in with all of the ideas and information in this video as you follow along. You can find the link to download it in the description below. Also, this is a video you may want to save and come back to as you move along planning your podcast. So why is video podcasting so popular right now and appealing to so many creators and audiences? And why is it stirring up so much controversy in the industry? Let's find out. Well, on one side, we have some folks from the podcast industry arguing that podcasts are audio only and distributed via RSS, and that video podcasts are just video. And on the other side, we have those who really don't care much about labels, and they just want to create audio and video content and distribute it to different audiences on different platforms. But whatever side you're on, there's no denying that producing a video podcast is the most efficient way to create content, connect with your audience through audio and video, and leverage search engines like YouTube to grow your audience faster or at all. We all know how hard it is to grow your audience with audio-only podcasts as an independent podcaster. Another reason creating a video podcast is a smart idea is that you will have a presence on YouTube and social media where big audiences are. We are experiencing some interesting times right now. Things are changing when it comes to media consumption, and podcast creators are banking on this. Mi prima Cori Sanchez shared in a recent podcast, she's prima mía, somos primas, my cousin. Cori Sanchez shared in a recent podcast interview how news networks like CNN and Fox News have reported a considerable decline in viewership in the last few years, and cable TV is a thing of the past. Do you have cable still? If you do, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You have to watch the advertisements of Viagra, antidepressants. You take both. You take your Viagra. Yeah, stop it. So where are people going? Well, audiences are turning to influential creators on YouTube, podcasts, and social media as their main source of news, education, and entertainment. And you can be one of them. This is also confirmed by a recent study published by eMarketer, which shows that the average hours spent per day watching digital videos are surpassing the hours someone watches traditional television. Interesting, right? Todos pegados del teléfono. So it wouldn't be a stretch to say that we may see some of that TV advertisement money shifting from television networks to independent creators in the future. Fingers crossed. Sign me in. I want to be the first one. Ve al otro allá atrás. So I hope you're convinced that this is definitely a great time to get into video podcasting and start building your authority, connecting with your audience, and becoming an influential voice in your industry. So how do you start a video podcast? Where do you start? We're going to get into that in a moment. But I thought I would have a jalón de orejas moment, a slap on the wrist moment with you, because as some of you are doing this thing, I have done it too, and we have to collectively agree to stop doing it for our own benefit. Are you curious? I have a tendency when I get an idea in my mind to immediately go to Amazon and start buying stuff in preparation for the project. I have to admit that I still have the glue, pinboards, and cute adornments I got a couple of years ago when I got the idea of putting a vision board together. And you want to know a secret? I haven't even started. They're still there, gathering dust. And why do I bring up this idea? Well, I have seen many of my clients, when they finally come to me for help, they have already purchased equipment and signed up for services that they don't even need yet, because they got the idea that they wanted to start a video podcast and they went ahead and got on Amazon and purchased a bunch of equipment. And this is a very common thing, let me tell you. James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, discusses this phenomenon in his book. He says that people sometimes focus on motion, getting ready to act, instead of action, actually doing the task. So instead of focusing on motion and buying equipment that will gather dust and more often than not won't work for your needs, let's focus on planning and designing your show on paper. It might not feel like you are taking action, but spending time planning and designing every detail of your video podcast will pay off in the end. You will have a final product that's well thought out, built with your audience in mind, and has your unique touch all over it. So when you're planning your video podcast, I want you to focus on the 3 W's: what, who, and why. Let's start with the what. The what is all about the concept you are developing in your show. It's the main idea or topic for your video podcast. Let me illustrate this point with some examples from some of the video podcasts I have in my queue right now. So for the Lex Fridman podcast, the concept is deep, long conversations with experts and thinkers in areas like artificial intelligence, science, technology, philosophy, and history. Then we have the Mindset Mentor podcast with Rob Dial that focuses on personal development, motivation, and the psychology of success. And there's Women of Impact, hosted by Lisa Bilyeu, which is all about empowering women to overcome challenges, build confidence, and live an impactful life. This idea is perfectly illustrated in one of the books I'm reading right now. In his book, That Will Never Work, Netflix co-founder Mark Randolph shares the idea of starting with a clear concept and evolving it through real-world testing. If you don't have a clear concept for your show, you won't be testing it with an audience. You'll be contributing to the noise. So take a moment to jot down a few ideas and feel free to pause this video to answer these 3 questions. What's the main idea of your show? What information do you want to share, and in what format? Then after the what comes the who. And the who is your audience. Is where, the people, the Patricios, the Martas, the Franciscos. And here's where I've seen clients fall on both sides of the spectrum. Some come to me having no idea who would they be making their podcast for, while others already know who their audience is going to be because their audience is also their clients and prospects. Either way, I encourage you to go through the exercise of writing down some specifics about your audience. Who are they? What are their interests, habits, and struggles? Think about demographics like age, profession, or hobbies, and even go deeper into their values and goals. This will help you craft a show that truly resonates with them, ensuring that your podcast speaks directly to the people you want to engage with. And here are some examples. I like to provide a lot of examples because that's how I like to learn. Let's say your listeners might have a certain level of education and are deeply interested in topics like history, technology, and philosophy. Or maybe they are self-seekers always looking to improve their lives, or they're fascinated by science and tools to enhance their quality of life. You get it. By understanding these details, you'll be able to create content that speaks directly to their interests and needs. And then we move on to the why, and the why is your list of reasons why you want to produce a video podcast. And this list can include personal reasons and business reasons as well. And let me give you some examples. Maybe one of your reasons is that you want to share your expertise and grow an audience around a topic that you're passionate about, something that you know can help your audience in some way. And how cool would that be that you get to sit down to record a video podcast every week, every 2 weeks, whatever the frequency, to share your knowledge and expertise, and to know that people will be receiving it, that people will be changing their lives because of that information that you so generously record in your video podcast. That's pretty cool. It could also be that you want to educate your prospects if you are a business owner and you want them to be educated as far as how the product or how the service can improve their lives. So when they come to you, they already have some information and they're already educated in what you do. These are all powerful reasons that drive the why behind a video podcast or any project for that matter. And there's a lot more to planning a show, but your detailed answer to these 3 questions, it's a very good start. Now that we've tackled those 3 big questions, the what, the who, and the why, let's move on to production and how the heck am I going to breathe life into this video podcast? How am I going to put it together? How am I going to record it? Shit. In this production phase is where we focus on designing and building your video podcast studio, choosing the right equipment and getting comfortable with it. Because let me tell you, it's one thing to order all of that fancy equipment and get it delivered to your studio. And another one, very different, is to get it out of the box and use it. I digress, but let's go back to setting up your studio. This is my favorite part of the project. It means that you have to think about how you're going to place things in the studio, the lighting and the different pieces of equipment. It's all about creating a space that not only looks great on camera, but also feels professional and inspiring for you to work in and to create. Then comes choosing the right equipment. This includes your cameras, microphones, lights, and even the software you'll be using to record your episodes. The key here is to find equipment that fits your budget while still delivering good quality. And finally, you need to get trained and familiarized with all of this equipment. But before we break everything down, there's one important step that I want you to do, and that's to make a list of your production goals. Ask yourself, are you planning to record your show in a dedicated studio, or will you be traveling, recording in conferences, hotel rooms, and other open spaces while on the go? Like one of our clients, Ryan from What the Futures podcast, he has his studio where he records his video podcast, but he also travels and goes to conferences and he brings his portable equipment with him. So we needed to work with him, getting him equipment that will work for both. Next, think about your guest setup. Will you be connecting remotely with your guests, or will you have them there in your studio and interview them face to face, or have your co-host there in studio with you? And lastly, consider whether you are going to have a co-host or will you be running the show solo. The more clear you are about how you want to produce your video podcast, the easier it will be to make decisions about buying the right equipment and building your studio setup. So take a minute to think this through, jot down all your ideas, and then come back to me. So now let's talk about setting up your podcast studio, which is my favorite thing to do for clients. Since a video podcast is more than just audio, you will want to pay attention to your recording space. The background will be part of what the viewers see, so you can get creative with colors, furniture, signs, props, and decorations. You get to decide what kind of a vibe you want to give with your show, and how you set up your studio will play a big role in building your podcast brand. You can create a blueprint of your studio to help you with this step. I usually create a scale template for the space and I start adding equipment and furniture to the space so I can visualize how it's going to look. And I use Canva for this, but you can use any other software to help you creating your blueprint for your studio. And don't forget the practical stuff like windows, air vents, and any background noises that you may have in your recording area. We want to tame this as much as we can so they don't get into the recording. Now your favorite thing, and I don't want you to go to Amazon and start, please, but I'm going to talk about equipment, okay? Now let's get into equipment. Your video podcast studio really needs three main things: a way to record audio, a way to record video, and lighting. Each of these areas will require different equipment and a different budget depending on your production goals. For example, if you're recording a video podcast remotely from your office, connecting with guests, you'll need less equipment compared to a full studio setup with multiple people and multiple cameras and several microphones in the studio. The more production value your podcast requires, the more equipment, training, and help you'll need. This could mean bringing in a technician to assist during recordings or an editor to help you polish up your episode afterward. Also, if you're recording your podcast outside of a studio, like at a conference or other event, you'll need portable recording equipment. You want something easy to carry and flexible enough to handle different recording conditions. For cameras, we use a few different models here in the studio. We have the Sony CV1 and the Sony CVE10, which are fantastic options for beginners, and they're very budget friendly. For a higher end production, we use the Sony A7 Mark III and the Sony A7 Mark IV. These are our go-to cameras because we can attach premium lenses to get a sharper, more cinematic look to our videos. When it comes to audio, let me show you a few choices depending on your setup. For events, wireless microphones like the Rode Wireless Go or the Rode Wireless Me, which are the ones that we have in the studio, are a very great option. In the studio, we've used the Shure MV7, the Shure SM7B, and the Shure SM7DV. These microphones are solid options, and the Shure MV7 is particularly versatile because it's a USB microphone and also an XLR microphone you can plug into an audio interface. We also have the PodMics, both USB and non-USB microphones are really good. One of my favorites. And the one that I'm using right here, which is very popular among sports commentators, is the Electro Voice RE20. And the next step is training. What kind of training and how much training you'll need to record and edit your video podcast. And for this point, I decided to create a graphic to explain this better to you. There are two variables that come into play that will determine the amount of training you will need, and those are production, or the level of production, and budget. If you're aiming for a high production podcast with multiple camera angles, complex audio setups, and professional gear like cinematic lenses and lighting, you won't need much training if your budget matches your vision, because then you can hire a technician to handle all of the technical stuff and help you record. And after everything is recorded, you will have an editor ready to edit your raw footage. Or maybe you will have a complete production team of multiple people, and that will go really smooth. And the only thing that you have to learn is to sit down in your chair and put up a good performance. But if you want to have a video podcast with high production value on a tight budget, then you'll likely need to learn how to handle most of the technical work yourself. That means learning how to set up, use, and troubleshoot your equipment while also being the talent. And if hiring a video editor isn't in your budget either, then you'll also have to learn how to edit your video podcast. And yes, you may not have the luxury of a full production team. We all want a production team, but with some affordable gear like entry-level cameras, basic lighting setups, and a solid microphone, you can still create a professional looking video podcast. So don't get discouraged. But if you are working with a small production but have a good sizable budget for your project, then you'll need minimal training. With your budget, you can hire a professional editor to handle post-production, meaning that all you really need to know is to learn how to record your episodes and how to upload the files to the drive so your editor can access them and start working on your project. Even with a simple setup, you'll still get great results by investing in quality equipment and outsourcing the more time-consuming task like editing. By the way, if you're looking for a video editor, it just so happens that we train the best editors in the industry. If you need to find one for your project, make sure that you send me an email or that you go to podsoundschool.com to get all of the information. I'll get you set up with an editor. Cool. But let's say you're working with a smaller production on a tight budget, then you'll need to take a DIY approach to most of the process. You'll likely be handling everything yourself from recording to editing, and this means investing in budget-friendly equipment like affordable microphones, basic lighting, and maybe just one single camera. And while you may not have the highest end gear or a production team, you can still create quality content using recording solutions like Riverside FM or Descript. If you are in the situation, the key is to keep things simple and work with what you have and gradually improve your setup as you go. You just need to start. I don't want you to get discouraged. And if you were wondering how to enlist our help, we work with clients across the board with different needs and budgets. We offer one-on-one services, group coaching, and DIY programs, so don't hesitate to reach out. Go to podsoundschool.com for more information or find the link in the description below. Another key area of your video podcast is the posting and distribution. This is the next step after you get your episode edited and with all of the bells and whistles from your editor or after you've done all the editing. So let me show you my distribution strategy. And for this, I like to think about video and audio distribution separately. You have different options for video: YouTube, Spotify, and social media, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn mainly. So let's start with YouTube. You can post your video podcast as a regular video or as a podcast that will also be available on YouTube Music. YouTube is a search engine, meaning that millions of users are searching for information every minute. And the key to having your video podcast suggested to users on YouTube is optimizing your episodes and making great episodes with great content to keep your viewers engaged. If you post your episodes without any optimization or strategy, they will not perform on YouTube. I've seen many podcast creators use the spray and pray strategy and complain that YouTube does not work. The spray and pray strategy is that you take your video podcast and you just throw it on YouTube, and that's it. You don't optimize it. You don't follow the optimization guidelines to make the video more searchable or to make it even discoverable. So it doesn't work. The three main things to watch on YouTube are thumbnails, titles, and watch time. Designing great thumbnails that make people click, using titles with keywords, and recording episodes full of value your audience wants to watch is the key of growing on YouTube. Another platform I would recommend for posting your video podcast is Spotify. Spotify also supports video through its free podcast hosting service, Spotify for Podcasters. I have a video here on the channel showing the steps to upload and distribute a video podcast on Spotify. I will add the link to that video in the description, and also other links to videos that you may be interested in as well. After watching this video, check the description. Aside from YouTube, Spotify is also a strategic place to host and distribute your video podcast. The way that this works is that you upload your video podcast to Spotify for Podcasters. Then every time you publish an episode, it will automatically be distributed to Spotify so people can enjoy the podcast in either video form or audio form. Spotify is also known for its smart algorithm, which track user behavior on the platform and suggest content based on interest similar to YouTube. They're also adding new features to make video podcasts more discoverable, like the TikTok style homepage, where users can scroll through video clips and AI-generated scripts, making podcasts more searchable and more discoverable. When it comes to distributing the audio-only portion of your podcast to Apple Podcasts or Amazon Music, which are audio-only platforms, then you have different options. If you're hosting your video podcast on Spotify for Podcasters, then the only thing you have to do is go into your account and enable the RSS distribution of your audio-only podcast to Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music and the other audio-only podcast players. So every time you post a new episode of your video podcast, then the video will be distributed to Spotify and the audio only will be distributed to the audio only platforms via RSS feed. You can also choose to distribute your audio-only podcast and your video podcast separately and use a paid podcast hosting service. I recommend Buzzsprout and RSS.com to my clients when they have specific goals or need more features than what Spotify for Podcasters offers for free. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, there are different ways that you can record your video podcast, and this will require different types of equipment and a different setup. And I created this playlist right here with the different types of studios that you can have for your video podcast. You will learn a lot. You will learn about equipment. You will learn about strategy. So don't waste any time. Move on to the next video.